Welcome to today's deep dive. I want you to picture something for a second. Think of a hospital corridor, but at like 2 in the morning.
Oh, wow. Yeah. That very specific kind of quiet.
Right, it's that eerie quiet, the lights are dimmed to that cool clinical blue, and the daytime hustle, the doctors, the administrators, the visitors, that's just completely gone.
It's totally deserted.
Yeah, and you just have like a single medical professional walking down a long tiled hallway. During the day, that environment is loud and heavily structured, right?
Absolutely. Packed with visible leadership and constant movement.
Exactly. But right now, at 2 a.m., the entire weight of that ward, the literal lives of dozens of patients, it all rests on a much smaller team operating entirely in the quiet hours.
It is such a striking image, honestly.
It's a fascinating dynamic, and it turns out the survival mechanics of that lone 2 a.m. nurse hold the exact secret to how boarding schools, residential facilities, and frankly, even modern remote companies need to handle their most vulnerable moments. That's our mission today, diving into a really cool document called What a DSL Can Learn from a Night Shift Nurse.
And it perfectly bridges two professions that most people would just never put in the same category. I mean, think about a boarding school or any pastoral care environment. There's a highly predictable daily rhythm. Yeah.
Yeah, lots of bells ringing and schedules.
Right. The day is intensely supervised. You have senior leaders walking the halls. Schedules are strictly enforced. And if a crisis happens, a dozen people are immediately available to support.
But then the sun goes down.
Exactly. Just like that hospital, the building fundamentally changes its identity. The senior leaders drive home, staffing drops to a skeletal crew, and the students retreat to their rooms and become much less visible.
They kind of just disappear into the woodwork.
Yeah, they do. And the core premise we're exploring today is that in those quiet hours, the need for keeping those people safe doesn't just pause until morning. It becomes entirely dependent on the underlying culture that was or wasn't built during the day.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because before we get too deep into the psychology of the night shift, we need to clarify what we're actually talking about when we say keeping people safe.
Good point. Context is key here.
Right. So in a school environment, the term is usually safeguarding, and it's managed by a designated safeguarding lid, or a DSL. For anyone listening who hasn't worked in education, that sounds like, I don't know, a mild administrative role.
Like someone checking the fire extinguishers or something.
Exactly, like an inspector. But the stakes are wildly different, aren't they?
Oh, the stakes couldn't be higher. A DSL isn't just an administrator. They are the central hub for the physical, emotional, and psychological safety of the students.
So we're talking big issues here.
Huge issues. Safeguarding involves identifying and managing severe mental health crises, uncovering domestic abuse, handling disclosures of self-harm, navigating really complex behavioral issues. It's basically high-stakes triage.
Wow.
Yeah, and during the day, a DSL might have a whole team of counselors and teachers to consult when, say, a 15-year-old is having a panic attack.
But at 2 a.m.
At 2 a.m., the person dealing with that exact same panic attack might be a single residential staff member who is solely responsible for an entire dormitory.
Which brings a metaphor immediately to my mind. Is this essentially like learning to drive?
Ooh, I like where this is going. How so?
Well, when you have the driving instructor sitting in the passenger seat next to you with their own set of foot brakes and an extra rearview mirror.
The dual controls, right?
Yeah, the whole system feels incredibly safe. You feel like a highly competent driver because the system literally won't let you crash.
It's doing the heavy lifting for you.
Right. But you only really find out if you possess actual driving skills when you're completely alone in the car at midnight in the pouring rain trying to navigate a sharp turn.
That analogy perfectly separates supported performance from actual competence. What's fascinating here is that we have to completely dismantle the illusion that just because a system works smoothly at 2 p.m., the organization is structurally sound.
Because it's an illusion created by daylight.
Exactly. A daytime system is propped up by visible leadership and immediate redundancy. When the instructor goes home and takes their foot off that emergency brake, you're left with what the Force calls the night shift principle.
The night shift principle, I like that.
Yeah. At night, there are almost no immediate checks and balances. A residential staff member can't just knock on the principal's door to ask for advice.
Because the principal is asleep.
Right. They have to rely entirely on their own judgment, the muscle memory of their training, and most critically, the ingrained invisible culture of the institution. It's about what happens when no one is watching.
I hear that, but realistically, and I have to push back a little here, isn't it just basic human nature to act differently when the boss is away?
Sure, people relax a bit.
Yeah, I mean, we all know the phrase, when the cat's away, the mice will play. If you remove the surveillance and the oversight, humans tend to cut corners. So how on earth do you build a system that works in the dark without secretly relying on the fear of a supervisor randomly dropping in to check on things?
That is the big question. But if a system relies on the threat of a random supervisor dropping in, it isn't a culture at all. It's just a surveillance state.
Oh, that's a good distinction.
Right. The moment the camera is turned off, the behavior just reverts. The night shift principle argues something much more profound. It states that your organizational culture is only as strong as your least supervised moment.
Wow, your least supervised moment.
Yes. It completely flips the traditional metric for organizational strength. We usually measure a company or a school by how it operates at peak capacity during the busiest hours.
Like 10 a.m. on a Tuesday.
Exactly. But this is a strategic reframe. It dictates that true organizational integrity is defined exclusively by the absence of leadership, not its presence.
That's huge.
It is. You build independence by shifting the staff's understanding of what they're actually managing in the dark. Because they aren't just dealing with less supervision, they're dealing with an entirely different type of risk.
I want to explore that because usually we think of risk as a constant physical thing.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, if we go back to the boarding school environment, a broken stair in a dimly lit hallway is a tripping hazard. It's a risk at noon and it's a risk at midnight. It's static.
Right, it doesn't change.
But what we're looking at suggests that the actual type of risk completely morphs when the sun goes down. Is it fair to say daytime risks are like hardware bugs, while nighttime risks are software glitches?
Oh, expand on that. How are you defining the difference there?
Well, a daytime risk, like a physical fight in the cafeteria or a broken door lock, that's a hardware bug. It's highly visible, it's mechanical, and the fix is obvious.
You see it, you fix it.
Exactly. But at night, the risk becomes a software glitch. It's invisible, it's purely behavioral, and it only triggers under very specific, unseen emotional loads that you just can't spot by walking down a hallway.
That captures the mechanism perfectly.
Ooh.
At night, you're dealing with time-based risk patterns. Let's look at the psychology of a teenager in a residential environment.
Okay.
During the day, they're performing. The adolescent brain is highly attuned to social standing, right? So they spend their daylight hours expending massive amounts of energy maintaining a daytime mask for their peers and their teachers.
Which has to be exhausting.
It's completely exhausting. But at night, the audience disappears. The peer surveillance drops. Biological fatigue sets in, and their cortisol levels fluctuate.
So the mask slips.
The mask totally slips. Without the constant distraction of a rigid schedule, the internal dialogue they've been suppressing all day is forced to the surface. Nighttime naturally breeds homesickness, rumination, and a really deep psychological sense of isolation.
The shadows get longer, literally and emotionally. So the hardware of the building hasn't changed at all, but the emotional software of every single person inside it is running a completely different, highly vulnerable program.
And this is where most training programs just fail. If leadership only trains their staff to look for hardware bugs, the broken stairs, the loud arguments, the obvious physical dangers, those staff members will be completely blind to the software glitches.
Because they aren't looking for them.
Right. They won't notice the subtle, dangerous shifts happening in the dark. Safeguarding isn't a static checklist. It shifts dynamically with time and context. So supervision models have to dynamically adjust to match the emotional volatility of the hour.
But wait, if the psychological defenses are crumbling and all this vulnerability is bubbling up, does that mean the students or patients in the hospital parallel are more likely to actually talk about what's going wrong?
Yes. That is the counterintuitive advantage of the quiet hours.
Right.
Yeah. While the risks of self-harm or emotional spiraling elevate, so does the likelihood of genuine disclosure. Patients in clinical wards and students in boarding houses frequently speak much more openly at night.
Because the pressure is off.
Exactly. Disclosures, those pivotal moments where someone finally reveals a deep struggle or ongoing abuse or a hidden mental health crisis, they rarely happen in the middle of a bustling day.
That makes sense.
They happen when the social pressure is removed and the environment feels significantly calmer. There's a profound professional truth at play here. Disclosure happens when an environment feels safe, not when it feels structured.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me. If the evidence shows that the most vulnerable, crucial disclosures happen when things are quiet and unstructured, are organizations actually getting in their own way with too many formal check-ins?
Oh, absolutely.
Because I'm thinking about schools, but also like corporate HR departments. Are we setting up these rigid, brightly lit daytime meetings going, please sit in this chair and tell me your deepest trauma between 2.0 and 2.15 p.m., when human psychology dictates that people only open up when that exact structure is stripped away?
Overstructuring definitely becomes a barrier to genuine communication.
Hmm.
When we create sterile, highly formalized environments, we usually do it because it makes the organization feel like it's taking the issue seriously.
Right. It looks good on paper. It produces a paper trail.
Exactly. But to the vulnerable person sitting across the desk, it feels like an interrogation. Think about the physical dynamics of a daytime meeting. You're usually sitting across a desk from an authority figure, maintaining direct eye contact.
Which is intimidating.
Neurologically speaking, direct eye contact in a formal setting elevates threat perception.
It triggers a defensive response.
Precisely. Now compare that to 10:30 p.m. in the residential house kitchen. A staff member and a teenager are standing side by side, waiting for a kettle to boil to make a cup of tea.
Okay, totally different vibe.
They're looking at the kettle, right, not at each other. The power dynamic is neutralized by the informal setting and the lack of direct eye contact. The threat perception drops.
Wow.
That is the exact moment the teenager will quietly mention that they're terrified of going home for the holidays or that they're experiencing severe anxiety. The real life-saving work doesn't happen in the scheduled 2 p.m. office meeting. It happens in the margins.
I love that. But that reality introduces a massive new problem, doesn't it?
It does.
If the quietest, least supervised moments are precisely when the heaviest, most complex disclosures happen, then the staff members making that cup of tea are carrying a disproportionate, massive burden.
It's a huge weight.
They're absorbing the heaviest emotional weight with the absolute lightest amount of backup.
The weight of autonomy is immense. When you have reduced staffing, every single decision that isolated staff member makes carries exponentially more weight.
Because there's no one else to ask.
Yeah. Right. If a student discloses a severe intent to self-harm at 11 p.m., there is no team down the hall to consult. The staff member has to assess the immediate physical danger, manage the student's emotional state, and decide whether to wake up a senior leader, all in a matter of seconds.
That sounds terrifying, honestly.
They operate with greater autonomy, which, sounds empowering in corporate theory, but in safeguarding, autonomy simply means fewer immediate resources. Safeguarding risk naturally increases as organizational capacity decreases.
So what does this all mean? Because this is where the hospital nurse parallel seems to hit a wall for me.
How so?
Well, a night shift nurse has very literal step-by-step medical protocols. It's 3 a.m., a patient's heart rate spikes. The nurse looks at the chart, identifies the symptom, and administers a specific milligram of a specific drug from a locked cabinet.
Right, it's clinical cause and effect.
Exactly. But a boarding school staff member, or anyone managing people, really, is dealing with messy, unpredictable human emotions. You can't just administer a 50-milligram dose of feeling better to a teenager having a psychological crisis. The variables are infinite.
You've identified the exact limitation of the analogy, and the source actually addresses this honest bit. It's a critical difference. The clinical environment is defined by highly structured medical protocols. You can algorithmize a biological response.
But you can't algorithmize feelings.
Exactly. The educational or pastoral environment is deeply dynamic. Human volatility cannot be solved with a flowchart. If you expect a lone staff member to act like a clinical machine, processing emotional crises with perfect detached efficiency, you will literally break the staff member.
Because they're absorbing the trauma themselves.
Yes. And because safeguarding cannot rely solely on the heroism of isolated individuals. The system must step in to act as the invisible support structure when human leadership isn't physically in the room.
So the system is the backup.
The whole purpose of the system is to support the staff member. So the staff member has the emotional bandwidth to support the student. Isolation for that staff member must be reduced wherever absolutely possible.
How do you do that at 2 a.m.?
They need perfectly clear, unambiguous escalation pathways. They need to know exactly what threshold of risk requires waking up the head of the school at 2 a.m. And more importantly, they need to know they won't be reprimanded for making that call.
Right. No one wants to wake up the boss unless they know it's okay. Which brings us to the ultimate goal. How do we take all of this, the shifting psychological risks, the power of unstructured spaces, the heavy burden on isolated staff, and actually build something bulletproof?
It takes work.
How do we build a system that works in the dark?
It requires building what we can call the leadership layer, creating a true 24/7 safeguarding culture. It means safeguarding must be consistent at all times, across all contexts, with absolutely no gaps in provision.
So no crossing your fingers and hoping for the best at night.
Exactly. It's not enough to have a great daytime protocol. It requires three specific structural commitments. First, solid foundations. This means ensuring safety and care are guaranteed regardless of the hour, with supervision models that adapt to the time of day, not just the convenience of the staff schedule.
So scheduling staff when the software glitches are most likely to happen, not just when it's easy to fill a shift.
Precisely. Second, developmental pathways. Organizations have to build well-being literacy into the community itself.
What does that mean practically?
It means students need to be taught how to articulate their emotional state before they hit a crisis point. And staff must be explicitly trained to recognize those time-based, invisible risks we discussed, rather than just looking for broken hardware.
That makes total sense.
And finally, leadership consistency. The system has to operate with the exact same integrity when the CEO or the headmaster is asleep as it does when they are standing at a podium.
It all boils down to one incredibly challenging system-level question, doesn't it? What does the culture of your setting look like at 10:0 p.m., and is it functionally as strong as it is at 10:0 p.m.?
That is the ultimate litmus test for any leader. If there's a massive disparity between your 10 a.m. strength and your 10 p.m. strength, you don't have a strong culture. You just have a well-rehearsed performance.
Wow. A well-rehearsed performance.
Right. The night shift nurse or the nighttime residential worker sees what others don't. They notice the quiet behavioral changes, they support people in the unseen marginal moments, and they physically keep the system safe when it is operating at its most vulnerable capacity.
They're the unsung heroes.
Truly. And genuine safeguarding demands that exact same awareness from the very top of the organization. Not just in the highly visible, heavily structured parts of the day where everyone is watching, but in the quiet hours when the system just has to hold under its own weight.
And this brings the entire concept out of the hospital, out of the boarding school, and right to the reality of anyone managing people today. Because, even if you listening right now don't work with vulnerable teenagers, the psychology of the night shift principle applies to how humans operate in any group.
It's universal.
It is. If you're managing a remote corporate team spread out across different time zones, when you log off, someone else's night shift begins.
Absolutely.
If you run a small business, or frankly, if you're simply the head of a household trying to raise resilient kids, the true test of your leadership isn't what happens when you're standing at the front of the room barking orders or when the Slack dot is green and everyone is replying instantly.
The true test is what people do when the external pressure is removed.
Exactly. What happens when the lights are out on your project? When a remote employee hits a wall on a Friday evening with no manager online to ask for help, do they have the ingrained culture and psychological safety to make the right call, or does the culture you built immediately fracture?
That's the real measure.
We spend so much of our time and energy focusing on the driving instructor in the passenger seat, and we completely forget to prepare the solitary driver for the rain.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it forces a deeply uncomfortable reevaluation of our own impact as leaders, managers, or parents. We obsess over perfecting the daytime routine, the visible metrics, the scheduled meetings, the polished handbooks.
Because it's easy to measure.
Right. But the true character of an organization is forged in the margins, in the unscripted moments when no one is there to enforce the rules. So I will leave you with a final thought to mull over as you go about your day.
Let's hear it.
If an organization's true culture is defined entirely by what happens when the leaders go home, what is the night shift of your own life or workplace silently revealing right now? And are you brave enough to look at it?